The room was dark, dank. It was depressing in there. The patient was asking how much longer he had to live. It just felt like a room full of depression. And so I had raised the blind up in that room, told him that we needed to get more light in. And then I realized that this was probably not going to be enough. We needed to do more for him. So I talked to our respiratory therapists because I knew that we needed to get him outside in the sun. And there's this little area in our hospital with nice trees and plants, and it's protected around from the wind. As you can see there, this particular day it was kind of partly cloudy, but there was sun that was coming out, and I really felt it really moved me that we needed to get this gentleman outside. So I wrote an order in the chart that he needed to get full sunlight every day for 20 to 30 minutes. And our respiratory therapist was just so resourceful in getting two oxygen tanks together, combining it to get this gentleman on enough oxygen to get outside and away from the hospital. And that's what we did. And so that happened on that very first day. And I went home thinking, well, let's see if this works. I mean, according to the studies, it seems as though near infrared radiation should work. People used this 100 years ago. What's the risk of doing it now? Let's try it. Hello, Living Manna Church members. So good to have you here on True Health Tuesday. So this is coming into the height of the flu season. So we're going to talk today about viruses, not just the flu, but also COVID is making a resurgence and all sorts of viruses. And it's very clear as to why this happens in December every year like clockwork. And it has to do with sunlight. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. So if we look at what happens every single year, you can see very clearly that there are these peaks that go up and down in influenza deaths per year. And notice that the influenza deaths are right after the sun is the lowest in the sky. So in other words, it's January that we're seeing the peaks. And you can see this very clearly. It's not something that you would miss easily here. And you can see this is very clearly what the situation is in terms of flu deaths per week in the United States. If you remember with COVID-19, they showed that, in fact, the surge in Europe during 2020 was not related to temperature of the country, was not related to humidity, but was actually related to the latitude. So in other words, the higher you were up on the globe, like in Finland down here, that's the first countries that actually got the COVID surge during 2020. So Finland, Sweden, Russia, Great Britain, all the way down in the south, finally at the very end, which was Greece. And we went over these studies before as well. But again, what they did here on this study that was published in the British Journal of Dermatology was they looked at the parts of the United States and England and Italy that could not get enough vitamin D in the wintertime. And they found that even in those places where there was no vitamin D being made because it was so far north in the wintertime, there was still a difference between those that lived towards the south and those that lived toward the north, indicating that there was something other than vitamin D that was beneficial in sunlight towards COVID-19. And it caused them to say that given that the effect appears independent of a vitamin D pathway, it suggests possible new COVID-19 therapies. I teamed up with Margaret Scutch, and she is a professor of geography at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma in Mexico. And she and I published this paper looking at exactly that type of theory, is that when you look around the world in countries that have a high proportion of people with an elevated BMI, that those which had less sunlight, so these dark red areas up here, this would be cluster 4, high BMI and medium deaths, versus those that are a little bit closer to the equator, these orange ones, which is cluster 3, also had a high BMI, but they had lower deaths. And we believe this is related to sun exposure. This was a study that was published as well, and it shows that infrared light, which is a component of sunlight, actually it's the majority of sunlight is in the infrared region, actually does something to cells on a petri dish. It actually alleviates or relieves a mechanism of hyperinflammation called TLR4, which is toll-like receptor 4. It's a very complicated system, but this is the system that has been shown to be hyper revved up in patients with COVID-19. So in a petri dish, we can see that infrared light, at least at the cellular level, does have an effect on cells in terms of ramping down inflammation that you might get in COVID-19. The question, of course, is does it actually work in human beings, right? We don't care about cells on petri dishes. We want to know, is this going to work in cells in the human body? And to do that, you would need to have a very well randomized controlled trial where you take people who have COVID, for instance, in this case, and you bring them into the hospital and you treat them and you do something to one group that you don't do to the other group, but ideally it would be a randomized and controlled and blinded study. That's hard to do, especially when you're taking care of patients, but that's exactly what they did. This was a very well designed study, and it was actually published in a very prestigious journal called the Journal of Photochemistry and Photobiology. Specifically in biology, has an impact factor of 6.2, which, for those of you who don't understand and know this puts it in the top 5% of respected journals in its field. So this is a pretty notable study. And what they did in this study, which was pretty amazing, was they took patients with COVID-19 and exposed them using a jacket that had LED lights on the inside, pretty high density, and gave them this near infrared radiation. So you're probably thinking, well, what's the point of that? The skin is going to stop that light. The body's not going to even know that there's infrared radiation going through them. Well, that's the interesting thing about near infrared light is near infrared light can penetrate through the atmosphere at any angle, and it can penetrate through a few layers of your clothing to get deep down into your system. And in fact, some studies have shown that 70 to 80% of the cells in your body actually can, quote, see near infrared light that is coming from any source, including the sun. I mean, that's why they did the study. These people are not idiots, right? So they know that this light can actually penetrate through. I was recently given a photograph from Dr. Robert Fosbury, who is an astrophysicist at the European Space Agency, where he actually took a picture of his hand, and you could see a light source behind the hand, which was infrared, and this was an infrared photograph, and you could clearly see the light going through his hand very, very easily. So this type of light can actually penetrate through tissues. There's no question. If you want to think about this in a different way, think about a car pulling up to you, next to you, and they're playing very loud music. Now, you're not going to hear that music the same in your car next to the car that's playing the music, but rather you're going to hear predominantly low frequency sounds. And that's because low frequency energy can penetrate through things very, very easily. And near infrared radiation is in the lower frequency, the longer wavelength spectrum of the solar spectrum. So yes, so the key thing to understand here is that it could do it. It can go through. So what did they find? They found that these patients who were given this near infrared radiation were actually discharged from the hospital 4 days earlier, and they were able to have better pulmonary function testing. They had better hematological standards. This was a small study. There was only about 30 people in that study, but the effects were so powerful that they were statistically significant. It wasn't powered for mortality, and it didn't show that there was a change in mortality. But imagine if this was done. It's interesting to think that perhaps giving infrared radiation would give you this type of mortality like we have here in the summer for the flu, and taking it away, we would have this kind of mortality like we do in the wintertime for the flu. And I just want to show you that it's not just the flu that is related to sunlight. Look at this. This is actually a map of deaths per week in the United States from heart disease, cancer, obviously COVID-19 here in 2020, stroke, chronic lower respiratory diseases, Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, influenza, kidney disease. Notice that just about all of these diseases undulate with the season. Okay, and we've already shown you that it didn't have much to do with humidity or temperature, but it did track very well with latitude. And so I do believe that the sun and sunlight is driving this. The sad thing is that Americans spend only about 93%, sorry, about only 7% of their waking hours outside, 93% is inside. Kind of interesting. You may notice, interestingly, that the one thing that actually trends the opposite direction are accidents. And we know that in the summertime, there are more accidents in the summer because people are traveling more and things of that nature. But that's the one thing that bucks the trend. All of these natural causes of death, though, do peak in December and January. And let's not forget that this is what people did, hundreds of years ago. Here is, or at least 100 years ago, during the 1918 pandemic, in the Adventist sanitariums in the Northeast, they used hydrotherapy, which we've talked about before, fresh air, sleep, rest, sunshine. And in comparison to the Army hospitals, there was a significant reduction in influenza deaths. Only 2% went on to get pneumonia in the Adventist sanitariums, 16% pneumonia versus here in the Army hospitals, which used a lot of aspirin and kept their patients pretty much inside for the most part. And you can see here photographic proof of what we used to do 100 years ago by getting patients outside onto the rooftops, or if they actually had built it into their system, as you can see here. Here you can see here on the left, these were surgical cases and the senior girls, it says here, that were going outside. They noticed that the sun and healing actually improved when patients were outside in the sun. You can see they're basking in the sunlight. So knowing all of this, it was unusual for me to see COVID patients in the last year or so, but there was one that came in very recently to my hospital who was pretty severe, and I was asked to see him. And knowing all of this information, I was very motivated to get him outside. Let me tell you a little bit about his case, especially now that we have a number of patients that are like this. So this is a gentleman that at a different hospital with an orthopedic issue on day one was diagnosed with COVID incidentally because he was having some mild symptoms. And at that time, he was started on some dexamethasone, but he developed a reaction to it and wouldn't take it for another day or so. By day 7, his issue with the orthopedic issue was resolved and at least getting better, and so he was discharged home. However, by day 11, his COVID symptoms were getting worse, and he actually came into our hospital at 4 liters nasal cannula. Nasal cannula is one of these simple things that people put on to get oxygen. And the next day, by day 12, he had already gone up to a 10-liter oximizer, which is one of these devices that gives more oxygen. And this is when he was admitted to the hospital. He was started on Solumedrol, azithromycin, and they DC'd the Tylenol at that time. By the next day, he was again on 10 liters oximizer. I had still not yet been called to see this patient because I work in the intensive care unit and I don't get called unless patients are very, very severe. So you can imagine I was called on day 14 since he was diagnosed with COVID. At that time, he jumped to 35 liters, 100% FiO2 on high flow. And that's a device that looks like this, and it's pumping quite a bit of oxygen into the nose. Again, 100% oxygen. This is pretty much as high as you can go with conventional oxygen therapy before you get into ventilation or even non-invasive ventilation, so BiPAP or even getting put on a ventilator. So at this point, I was called to see the patient. I went into his room after I had gowned up, put on a hat, N95 mask. The room was dark, dank. It was depressing in there. The patient was asking how much longer he had to live. It just felt like a room full of depression. And so I had raised the blind up in that room, told him that we needed to get more light in. And then I realized that this was probably not going to be enough. We needed to do more for him. So I talked to our respiratory therapists, because I knew that we needed to get him outside in the sun. And there's this little area in our hospital with nice trees and plants, and it's protected around from the wind. As you can see there, this particular day it was kind of partly cloudy, but there was sun that was coming out, and I really felt, and it really moved me that we needed to get this gentleman outside. So I wrote an order in the chart that he needed to get full sunlight every day for 20 to 30 minutes. And our respiratory therapist was just so resourceful in getting two oxygen tanks together, combining it to get this gentleman on enough oxygen to get outside and away from the hospital. And that's what we did. And so that happened on that very first day. And I went home thinking, well, let's see if this works. I mean, according to the studies, it seems as though near infrared radiation should work. People used this 100 years ago. What's the risk of doing it now? Let's try it. And as you can see here, that the Solumedrol, these medications that were started back here on day 12, which is the standard of care, and which I would do on anyone, and still would do on anyone, you can see here that despite this, the patient was getting worse. When we instituted full sunlight for 20 to 30 minutes, you can see almost immediately there was a change from 35 liters at 100% oxygen down to 15 liters the next day. And the day after that, went down to 10 liters oximizer, 6 liters, 4 liters, and then finally the patient was discharged by day 19 and actually went home without any need for supplemental oxygen. I'll also tell you that not only was I meeting the physical needs of this patient, but when I went into that room and I talked to that patient, we also had a prayer, and we prayed about his condition, and that his condition was not only in the hands of the doctors, but the doctors are the hands of God, and so we were all working together for his benefit, and I believe that actually also had some benefit as well. So full sunlight. In addition, notice we did not stop Solumedrol. We did not stop the azithromycin that he was started on. We continued those things because I firmly believe that we really ought to be doing everything that we know is beneficial. And we know from the UK recovery trial that dexamethasone is beneficial in these patients. Unfortunately, we could not use that because he had a reaction to it. He did not have a reaction to the Solumedrol, and so we kept that on board. And so actually this is a picture of that very first day that he went outside. I was just compelled to take a picture. I did ask for their permission, and they gave me permission to use this photograph. I called him up about a week or two later. He was still recovering from his orthopedic situation, but was feeling much better, and he told me something very interesting. He told me that first day that he was very depressed, but that when he got out, as you can see right here, this is him in the wheelchair, that he said that sun on him felt so good to get outside. And as you can see, this is anecdotal, but you can see that the oxygen improved dramatically. I cannot prove that sunlight worked because of this case report, because case reports don't prove anything. But I was convinced by the evidence of what I saw in the studies that were published showing this. And I have to say that it's very gratifying to see that research can actually have an effect on individuals. So I am fairly convinced that we need to have hospitals that allow sunlight. I think sunlight is very, very powerful. There have been many studies that have shown that people who get sunlight when they're in the hospital, they just do better. When there's hospital rooms that have two beds, one bed closer to the door, the other bed closer to the window, the patient in the window bed seems to do better, seems to get out statistically significantly faster, has less mortality rate. All of these studies have shown that sunlight is very, very beneficial. So I do really think that we ought to start rethinking our stance on hospital architecture. I really do think that we need to get patients outside more. And until we can make some real changes in how that happens, that we ought to be thinking about getting patients outside for 20 to 30 minutes a day if it's possible. So what can we do for ourselves? I think we need to be a champion if you're a healthcare worker at your hospital for sunlight. If not, if you have a family member who's hospitalized or taking care of someone who's sick, encourage them to get outside into the sun if it's safe. The best time to do this is anytime. Do it when you can, especially now in the wintertime when the sun is not very high. Sometimes your choices are pretty limited, but get out there. You need to learn about the science about sunlight for ill patients. Start to read up on it. Start to become facile with it. And then you got to practice yourself what you preach. So get out there. Now, people might ask you, what is it that you do? And then you can tell them what you do. Educate your colleagues. Move the cause, use your clout, use your resources, share this video, share other videos. And I would have to say that, if hospitals are smart and they are financially responsible for the healthcare of their patients, which is becoming increasingly clear, they're going to do everything that they can to make sure that their patients are healthy, that they're discharged, and they don't come back as a bounce back, in other words, and they don't come back sick. And that's going to be financially rewarding not only for the hospital, but it's also going to be very rewarding in terms of health for the patient, and that's really what counts. So my message to you during this 2023-2024 season, when the sun is low and there's respiratory viruses all around us, is one of the things that you can do, one of the biggest things that you can do very easily, that will improve your health and your resistance against respiratory diseases is to get outside and get at least 20 to 30 minutes of sunlight every day. That is key because unfortunately, a lot of us work. We get up in the morning before the sun comes up and we are home after the sun goes down. And at our work, we don't go outside. And I think this is detrimental. So do this and encourage others to do the same. So for True Health Tuesdays, this is Dr. Roger Seheult signing off. Thanks for joining us.